going to get started. My name is Margie Maynard. I'm the Deputy Director for Engagement and Exhibitions here at the museum, and it's truly a pleasure to welcome Alistair Monroe and Raymond Holbert and Lewis Watts here today to talk about their dear friend and father, Arthur Monroe, and the effect and just the environment of jazz and the effect it had on his work and on the culture that he was contributing to in the Bay Area. I'm going to introduce Alistair, and then Alistair will kind of, in time, you'll get to know Raymond and Lewis. Alistair is an inner city, community-based cultural arts producer and promoter who works to enrich and beautify urban environments through humanitarian platforms. With an obvious, rich family history of artistry and hospitality, Alistair was the founder of the North Beach Jazz Festival, a vehicle for celebrating the legendary jazz history of San Francisco, and managed Bay Area's jazz ensemble, Mingus Among Us, when they toured Havana, Cuba, and performed alongside Grammy Award-winning legend Carlos Santana. As an artist, educator, Alistair founded the Oakland Cannery Collective to protect and preserve the Oakland Cannery Live-Work Artist Studios and his father's legacy. I just want to take this opportunity, since we're coming to the last stretch of this exhibition, to thank Alistair for all of his hard work, and especially his trust in the museum and the museum staff for mounting this exhibition, letting us come to the cannery multiple times and really just poking around and being pretty invasive. Privacy was not the rule of the day those days. But it helped us learn so much about Arthur and what his legacy means, and what it will mean in the annals of American art history. So thank you, Alistair, and have a great program.
Well, hello, and thank you, Margie. This is such a special moment for our life in general, but we are so very thankful to Linda Keaton and the Sonoma Valley Museum of Art for having us here, for opening their doors, and for representing a series of African American artists. Raymond Saunders, Richard Mayhew, and Arthur Monroe is legendary, and it goes down in history to showcase a series of that magnitude, the strength, and the challenge, and the risk-taking. It's so important. And to be sitting next to these two fine young men is just another special moment in time. I have some books in front here that are very special and valuable to not only African American history, but to the Beat generation, jazz, and the influence of abstract expressionism, African American art and history, the San Francisco Beat generation in Norway, the Beat culture in America from the Whitney Museum, Jazz at Keystone Corner, the North Beach Jazz Festival book that should have come out 20 years ago, and then the inside look of the earliest days of the Oakland Cannery and Arthur's studio, amongst a very valuable book from the Beat generation, The Frisco Kid, that will tell you all the beautiful stories of what it was like in the 60s. And there's a lot of red tape that have been uncovered in there, so you get a giggle along the way, to say the least. And then the influencers of Arthur's inspiration, coming from Dr. Radar Hueneslan, who was a physician for Edvard Munch, and their relationship to Hans Hofmann, Jackson Pollock, Klein de Kooning. Then you have Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, Ted Jones, amongst many other poets, Amiri Baraka, etc., Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and then skipping over to Harvey Tristan Cropper, whom I was named after, Alistair Tristan Monroe, who lived with and was teaching Charlie Parker how to paint. Then you have John Coltrane, and then you have Miles Davis, Dewey Redman, Art Lewis, and all the characters that were just all gigging and jamming in the Beat Generation circle, and then coming out west. So these turkeys to my right, you know, when you really look at their resumes and their timeline, and it's just so rich, full of magical education, history, you know, being artist professors, emeritus status, and so much more. Mr. Raymond Holbert, and to my immediate right, was born in California, living in Alameda, Berkeley, and Oakland. He holds 3 degrees in University, California, Berkeley, extensive experience in related disciples of fine and applied arts and related technologies. Mr. Holbert is an active freelance photographer, digital illustrator, and designer, former faculty member of the art department of the city of San Francisco City College for 35 years. He continues to be a big fan of personal journals, diaries, and daily reminders. Holbert's years, his daily writings and personal notes on his website, Memory Bank. As a mixed media artist, Holbert stays in the studio very widely, but mostly with his camera underwater in a swimming pool, playing Aquaman. Mr. Lewis Watts was born in Little Rock, Arkansas. He has a BA degree in political science as well as an MA degree in photography design in the University of Berkeley. He's a photographer, obviously, an author, lecturer, archivist, curator, professor of art at UC Santa Cruz, on top of being a historian. Who would have guessed? His research and artwork centers primarily in cultural landscape, focusing on African American communities in Oakland, Richmond, San Francisco, New Orleans, and Harlem, New York. He has been a teacher of photography at UC Santa Cruz and UC Berkeley since the 70s. His work is inspired by an historical and contemporary interest and representation of the African diaspora. So that's quite an impact on the community and to our educational system, invaluable to us. Thank you, and it's such an honor to have you all here. Let's give them a little bit of warm applause. And then depth of my gratitude is the fact that they've really known over the last several years of what I've gone through and what it truly means to protect and preserve your father's legacy on top of being an African American artist. You know, they see it from the lens. They're both professional photographers. And my sister Winona is here in the front, and our mother is a photographer, and they see life from a different lens. They truly dive deep and see things, obviously, that not sometimes, you know, to the human eye of their love and their passion, but to really to understand communities, the landscape, and the history within itself. They capture moments in time, over time, right? And then you go back to reflect on what the landscape was, the people were like, and how we have moved into the future, and some of the, you know, obviously the concerns that we have of things changing, global warming, etc. So going back in time, you know, I was curious about some of your wonderful influences in African American culture. I mean, we were a part of jazz in our DNA. Jazz was in our DNA, and for most, I had the opportunity about a month ago to speak at the Berkeley Junior College, and that was the first. I had spoken at the University of San Francisco about 20 years ago, and influencing the younger generation about jazz and the North Beach Jazz Festival. And here I was able to speak about jazz and protecting and preserving the artist studios and that history, because it all kind of comes in full circle. But let's start with Louis. Louis, coming from New Orleans, and has been so influential in traveling and seeing these cities from a different lens on that. And then I'll pick on Raymond a little bit later.
Well, the most important thing I wanted to say was that I met Raymond in Kroger Hall, the art building, when we were both, I think we were both graduate students, but we were both trying to talk to the same woman. and I'm not sure where she is, but we've remained friends ever since. That was the source of our friendship. I would say that he's actually my brother from another mother. We're really close.
Rachel is
Like his birthday.
Yes. What I was going to say that my sort of history with Arthur is that I had a chance to have an exhibit at the Oakland Museum, and I think Arthur probably had a lot to do with both that happening and also helping me navigate kind of that terrain. And it was always just great to just drop in on him. Both he was inspiring and kind of supportive and just not great to hang out with. And so that's sort of my memory of him. And I just absolutely love this show. I've seen some of these paintings before, but I think they really look good in this space. So I really like that support. And I guess the other thing I would say is that I've had a chance to both meet and sometimes photograph artists in a variety of places, and the sort of notion. My parents were both Southern born and sort of came west with a Great Migration, and I would say a lot of the work that I do is kind of based on that. What people brought with them when they came primarily from the South, but also going back to where people came from, New Orleans and Georgia and other places. And in some cases, seeing what would remain the same, then also seeing what had changed over time. In some cases, people came here with certain cultural and food and other interests. And because they wanted to sort of not lose what they had from home, they would sort of lock it in amber. And in some cases where they came from, that was no longer the case because it was not as important. So all that's really interesting about what's happening. And I've had a chance to do the same thing with migration in Europe and other parts of the world. This whole notion of how sort of culture and experience gets transferred from one place to the other, and kind of what changes. So I think that's something that I was able to talk to Arthur about, and he understood and had sort of insights about it. So I would just say it was really incredible, both honor and pleasure to have him both as a friend and as a mentor.
beautiful. Thank you.
That was Rachel. She was bored with us, so she said, "I'm leaving you in a class," and we were stuck with each other. That's how we basically became friends at that time. I like to think about history and how interesting things work. I think before going to Cal Berkeley, I had a job at Safeway Milk Plant as a pasteurized. It was a really good paying job. And my mother was so excited. She says, "God, you're the first African American to work at Safeway." It was in the Oakland Tribune. She was so excited about that. But I really wanted to pursue art more than anything. So I quit the job to the dismay of a lot of friends. Going back to college, she was saying, "You should go to the University of California. It's one of the best colleges in the world. It's right here in the Bay Area." And that's actually how I came to meet Lou. But eventually, over time, Arthur, I met Arthur at a very significant time. I'm looking at books here, and I'm thinking there's one book here, The African American Artist, that we both maybe discovered around the same time. Arthur, at the time, there was what was known as the Third World Department. People were starting to say, "Hey, maybe we should acknowledge other people in the art world. There are African American artists, there are women artists, there are Latin." So Arthur was one of the first people to teach, or he may have been the first person to teach the African American art history course at Cal. And to me, I'd known all about any European artist, everybody, but didn't know anything about African American artists. It turns out that none of us really knew. So I was excited. Arthur had some slides and some information, and I found this to be so exciting at the time. I thought, God, I want to learn more about this. So David Bradford, who's another friend of ours, was teaching the class but had no interest in art history. And he says, why don't you take over the art history part? And I thought, okay, which required an immediate study on my part for good. And during that period of time, Arthur and I talked a lot about African American artists, and I thought there were women that were involved. There was who's Romero Bearden, who's Charles White, and so on. And it was really exciting for me, along with what I knew in European art. So I guess around 1969 or so, when that class took place, I think it was sometime around there, City College of San Francisco, someone had decided that maybe we should open our art history section more. So I was hired to teach there that one class. My mother said, look, you made the newspaper, the San Francisco Chronicle, the first African American in the art department. Which it turns out that so many people in my generation, my age, for instance, I'm almost 80, were the first in most jobs that they had. But at City College, what was great is that there was quite a bit of interest, including my colleagues who were teaching other areas of art history. I thought, God, are there African American artists? I said, of course. So that stimulated, got me a full-time job there, and eventually I taught art history and practice of art. But over time, keeping in touch with Arthur, this actually cemented a relationship because we kept in contact, and he had a strong contact at the Oakland Museum as well. So we kept in contact because of that, and there were a lot of things that took place in our lives that were parallel, even though we didn't hang out together, we really knew each other well. The beat scene that was known, Herb King coined the phrase beat mix, and I thought the people that were in that category were pretty cool. You know, it was a little younger, but people were listening to jazz, and they were doing this kind of art that was exciting and had a lot to do with not just representing things on surfaces, but the act of placing things on surfaces became just as significant. So we talked a lot about that, and eventually over time, as I was saying, it became a long-term friendship over time, and it just kept growing over time. And eventually, we had a show of local artists that I was able to curate. Arthur was part of that, as well as Lewis and several other people. And it just kept growing. Now it's quite established. People have a much better sense of these things, I think, because of the influence of people like Arthur. Arthur, I think, maybe realized at the time that it was a very significant thing to do, is to follow this discipline, but being involved in San Francisco and the music involved at the time and the lifestyles, eventually I think in one of our conversations we talked about the significance of how design and music and fashion and everything started to be was part of the civil rights movement, essentially. I found that people part of the beat scene were cool, and I thought I'm going to buy an Austin Healey and be just like other people like we looked at British cars and things of that sort. There were just things that happened. The discovery of coffee houses and being a place where you could actually talk about art and drink espressos and macchiatos and all the different. So it was quite a worldly opening, I think. So I always think of Arthur in that way. He had his, even though his friends, they were a little different group because they were a little older, we still had these things that connected us. And I think about Arthur's connection with not only writers and City Arts bookstore, but local places where jazz was being played, the both end. I could probably name places here that people do know maybe about the jazz workshop. I was a minor at the time, but you could see Miles Davis at the Black Hawk if you stayed behind the screen. They had a screen for minors, and you could buy Coca-Cola for 75 cents and hear Miles Davis play things kind of good. So again, Arthur, by being around at that time, was experiencing the same thing, but in a much more mature fashion than I think I was at the time. And eventually, these things started to grow.
Well, and at that time, you know, New Yorkers were just so hip and cool. They had come west, you know. It's like the only city a New Yorker can be in is San Francisco, right? So we took a lot of pride in that. You know, when he went to the Korean War, Harvey Cropper went to the Korean War, and he felt that that was a calling for him to do, get in there before you're forced to go. And so he went right into the kitchen being a cook, and you know, when he got over there, thankfully the Korean War had just ended, so he was really probably boots on the ground for better part of about 6 months. And then he came back. Charlie Parker passed away, and he knew that Radar Wenneslaw went west and wanted to be in San Francisco and loved the beat culture there. So he really immersed himself into that community, and then realizing, you know, the importance of connecting with people, being a professor at Berkeley, along with Barbara Christensen, and she was one of the first female university African American studies, right? And then you realize the circle of artists. Back then, you have David Henderson, who is the writer for the Jimi Hendrix biography. Oliver Jackson, you know, Mary Lovelace O'Neill was a professor. Suzanne Jackson actually lived in the Oakland Cannery in Studio 6. She actually dated Arthur when he would allow her to come over, but she would listen to the music the whole time through the wall and just, and you know, practiced her art. And then you have Joe Sam, who was in the community then. I mean, there's just so many beautiful, amazing artists that were all connected from east to west. And now are, you know, over the last, you know, 10, 15 years are really starting to see the light for their talents. Well, they've always seen their light, but to be accepted and to be put on pedestals is so important. And then when you have Arthur's interest to want to travel, will study the Western Hemisphere and indigenous people going south to San Miguel Allende. He spent so much time down in Mexico and then ended up traveling with my mother all throughout South America. There's a few pieces in this show that are from the 60s, and then there's a series of prints that you'll see from San Miguel and Chile that are important. And on the back wall of the museum here, you'll see this tremendous amount of posters and the Breakfast Club of Berkeley, which is also a very important group that they would sit every week and just talk over coffee, smoking a million cigarettes, like the North Beach days, and Berkeley and North Beach were like, you know, almost like sister cities, you know, from time to time. But you know, the key is photography and seeing the community with Lewis and Raymond, and then also this beautiful book that Lewis, it was mentioned by Kathy Sloan, whom also worked at Keystone Corner as their photographer. Jessica Felix is here, who's, you know, played a major role at the Keystone and Todd Barkin's club, which was, you know, really kind of the more popular one over time, because there's other Keystone Corners. Todd Barkin is a huge advocate for all of the legends that have been out there. And my sister and I grew up with Charles Lloyd and Big Sur, and that kind of brought us, you know, closer to the Beach Boys who lived down there. And, you know, you had John Denver was down there, and so many other musicians would travel through there. But we had a hub where John and Judith Hendricks would come and stay with us. Hugh Masekela would come, and so many others. And we're so blessed to be a part of the Nepenthe restaurant family, where our great aunt and uncle Lolly and Bill Fassett purchased the property from Rita Hayworth and Orson Welles. And in the 60s, to have interracial children and taking that step was a big risk. And you know, you had to really understand the circumstances that happened from marrying an African American, having a relationship, and for what they stood for. Art Lewis, my stepdad, and Arthur Monroe were best friends. One was a jazz musician, one was a painter, one was Arthur, and one was Art. So there's a lot of art where and we were artistic children of that fact. But you know, with the eye of the lens and your experiences through the community. Raymond was really, you know, from the Bay Area and spends a lot of time, you know, understanding the lens from underwater, right? And he spends a lot of time on a day-to-day basis in the pool. And can you tell us a little bit about that and also its color, working with color, underwater photography? I love scuba diving back in the day. I still love it today, but haven't been able. I'm more of a bob in the water than I am a scuba diver. But I really appreciate being underwater. I've always loved it, and it's influential to see you in all of your social media prints and that goodness. So share a little bit more on that.
You know, it's funny you mentioned that. I was just thinking something I'd forgotten to mention a little earlier too about Arthur, but on the note of swimming. Under Arthur's bio, it lists that he spent time studying at the Art Students League in New York with Hans Hofmann. I don't know how many people are familiar with Hans Hofmann, but eventually it's funny that Hans Hofmann also came to California. And the whole notion of Hans Hofmann as an abstract artist, or part of it, was to change the philosophy of the University of California, Berkeley, which was the significance of color and the philosophy of push and pull. And many people who paint in an abstract manner know that in general, warm colors tend to advance and look as if they're closer, and cool colors tend to recede, and then people go forward from there. One of the things I learned just recently in swimming is that the more you work with people in the water and the reflection above them, the water, the more abstract that's become. So I'm learning here, besides painting, that one can also do that in photography. A lot of photographers nowadays, you'll notice, are working with being able to take what we call objective images and stretching them, making it much more towards a non-objective end, and also working with color in the same way. So I noticed that myself with water. So in a sense, you can say that photography can be the same way. Most times I think we use photography as a documenting form to be able to show things as they are. But being able to stretch photography and reach into that category of abstraction has changed. In my own teaching, I remember, and Arthur and I used to talk about this, is that there are really abstractions spoken about sometimes as singular, but it really is a spectrum. There's non-objective and there's objective abstraction. You have that whole range in between. So it opens it up to more people, probably. It can be more varied than ever. As far as models are concerned in the water, I'm just meeting a whole lot of new people, men and women, different ages. My oldest swimmer is 95. People are so cooperative with these images. And I post a lot of them on my website, but there's just so much to still learn, as I was saying, about how abstraction is part of photography as well. I love that. The fact that was well.
And it's impressive because a lot of black people don't swim, so how you get them in that water? Start moving them around, man. You get a bunch of lifeguards on the side, right?
It is a funny thought because there some people say the stereotype may be true. There were all kinds of reasons. When I was younger, my sister never did learn to swim. To this day, she has a swimming pool and still does not swim. But one of the things was the hair. It was cosmetic. She says, my hair has been pressed. I can't swim, if I hop in the water, and I came to understand how that worked. Things change over time with pressing, with perms and things of that sort, and different hairstyles. More varied hairstyles now than ever, which is great, I think. But for the most part, most people I knew that were what we conveniently call black, did not swim. And I was on the swim team, and one of the favorite jokes was that sometimes I would refer to as a cavity. You'd see 3 rows of what we conveniently call white bodies and 1 African American. So it was really done. It could have been racist at the time, but I looked at it and I think that's kind of funny because I was proud of the fact that I was such a good swimmer. And now I find more and more people able to. Swimming is such a thing. It's just universal. We all should know how to do it. But the the stereotype was largely real for a period of time for people in public pools. I went to a high school, Castlemont High School, and you had to be able to swim across the width of the pool in order to graduate from high school. The width was 20 feet, so people strolled for that. I was a lifeguard, so it just became so natural. I look at the Olympics and things nowadays, and I see more variation with African Americans that are part of this, and a lot of it had to do with opportunities. I'm sure pools and things of that sort. So anyway, still exciting. Swimming is good for you. And the older I get, the more I enjoy it. And I was pointed out by one of the women in the pool where I swim that it's like 3 to 1. More women seem to go for swimming than men. I've noticed that in my own research for some reason.
Well, those are beautiful stories, and he shares them all on his website too. So that's important, as well as Lewis's journeys to dig deep into communities. Arthur was a kind of a jet setter traveler back then, and it feels like Lewis has experienced those too, and their relationship. And Lewis, you're cousins with Mary. That's right?
Yep. Mary, I met Mary, but my mother's family was from Little Rock, and in fact, my father was discharged from the Army in Fort Lewis in Washington State, and he was on his way back to Atlanta, and I think he wandered into Seattle and got a job with the Urban League there. So he sent for my mother, and I was conceived in Seattle, but she said she didn't want to have a child in Seattle, Washington in 1946. So we went to Little Rock, which comes in handy, because when I'm in the South, people say, "Where are you from?" I'm from here. I only lived there for 4 months, but I do go back and forth, and so and I can say that I'm Southern born. And actually, it's interesting that when photography I didn't come to it till later in life. And the first place I went actually was to West Oakland, because there was all kinds of things in the landscape that reminded me of where people had come. A lot of people had migrated from Louisiana and Texas, and you could see it in the street, and the idea of the storefront church and improvising in terms of how you made a living. And I really got excited about that, and I think that's the Oakland Museum was interested in that. But the other thing was, I think my family moved to San Francisco in 1964. And I spent the summer before going away to college, and I remember I said, I think I want to live here, although it took me 3 years to get back. But someone said, "Do you want to go to the black area of San Francisco?" And I said, "Sure," not knowing anything about it. And someone took me to the Fillmore District on a Friday night in 1964, and it was incredible. It was from Hayes Street all the way up, way past Sutter. It was wall-to-wall people. People were dressed to the nines. You could hear music coming from the clubs. And I thought, wow, this is really something. I never forgot it. So then when I transferred to Berkeley, I went looking for it and couldn't find it, because in the meantime, it had been erased by urban renewal. So, and I kept asking me, what happened? And someone, actually Mildred Howard actually said, "I want you to photograph a shoe shine parlor that's on Fillmore by the Fillmore Auditorium." And I actually went there, and he had photographs of all the musicians and people from the community, and I got really excited about it. This is Red Powell, I think, and Red said, but was having none of it, because he had been jacked around by the city, and he had all these people say, "Can I help you out?" And he did not have anything to do with it. So it turned out Mildred's brother was good friends with him, and I'd like to think I went back a couple of months later. I think it was like 6 months. And when I went back, he was gone and the walls were bare. So I did a search to find out what had happened, and eventually I found out that the barber across the street, Reggie Pettis, had rescued. What happened was Red had a stroke, partly why he was kind of feisty with me. And the landlord had come and they started pulling photographs off the wall and was going to throw them out. So Reggie saw that what was going on and rescued the photographs. So when I saw that he had them, I was really excited about it, and he was too. And that was sort of the beginning of this sort of collection of photographs that first I think was shown when Willie Brown was the mayor. And then I had I met someone who worked for Bill Graham, and he had actually assigned her to find out where all the clubs were. So we both said we need to do a book, and eventually we did a book called Harlem of the West, which has had 4 editions, just went out of print, and I may be connecting with the museum to see if as soon as I have a minute, I'm going to try to get it published. But it basically was that what happened was after Pearl Harbor. That is also the neighborhood where San Francisco's Japantown was. And so the Japanese were interned, and people were recruited to come work in the shipyards all over the Bay Area. And the only place in San Francisco there was housing, or where black people could live, was in this recently opened up area of the Western Addition in Fillmore. And because it was an entertainment center, there was almost immediately clubs that played jazz and rhythm and blues, and and most of the clubs hired photographers. It's funny, the churches did not hire photographers, but the clubs did. So eventually, when we did research, we found many of the families of the photographers, and that came from the book. And I'll see if I'll get a copy of it here in the museum. It's called Harlem of the West. So that's kind of one of the stories. I'm actually working on a project now in North Richmond, where I live, the suburb just north of Berkeley. And there was another community that had a lot of people that migrated to work at the shipyards in Richmond from Texas and Louisiana. And they just got some money to make an amphitheater because there's a park there. And so I was sort of commissioned to collect photographs of a lot of the musicians, a lot of blues musicians, mostly jazz in San Francisco, but Richmond had blues musicians, and then a lot of athletes came from the neighborhood. So we collected them. They're going to go on the walls of this theater, the amphitheater when it goes out. So this idea of visual history seems to be a recurring pattern in my practice.
And North Beach and the Western Addition had a lot in common. I mean, it's really the jazz hubs, and especially from the East Village of New York, Greenwich Village, and North Beach. Another important fact is the Jibbo's Wop City Jazz Club. All the musicians that would travel west would stay and rehearse at the Westerfeld Mansion, which is the Russian embassy on Scott and Fulton, which was important. Our mother lived there, and then Herb Cain, used to photograph her when she married Art Lewis, and that made them move out of town to New York and then travel to see my father down in San Miguel, which was a special, sensitive moment in time. But then you learn so much about the history of this mansion in San Francisco, and they had their practice sessions, their late night parties, and it was such a hub. And when you would walk with my father down Fillmore Street, he would sometimes break into tears and frustration because they were the best barbecue spots, and that was where all the people of color were. And in North Beach, they were fading away fast, but they had the jazz clubs. And when I moved to San Francisco in '92, I really threw myself into the community and worked in a cafe called the North End Cafe. And I learned and caught up with time, started booking jazz in the cafe, and then the first major poetry reading we had was the Mayor Joe Alioto and the California historian Kevin Starr. Kevin Starr was a professor too down in Los Angeles at USC, whom I worked for his daughter at the North End Cafe. And we did so well over a couple of years. They offered me a small scholarship to USF, and I was proud of what I had done at the cafe and my love for the community. And I started a jazz festival, and left college for the jazz festival and to manage the jazz ensemble Mingus Among Us. And we were touring and going to Big Sur, and just kind of taking that stroll and really kind of following some of the footsteps that Arthur had made. The majority of paintings that you see really truly came from the Oakland Cannery, as he was gentrified out of San Francisco and moved to Oakland, far off the beaten path, way out on the east, San Leandro and Seminary, which kind of overlooks the Coliseum. But he really knew the East Coast mentality and the Edvard Munchs that really kind of started the live-work environment. So they mimicked that in New York and Manhattan, and he started that community out in East Oakland, which was a thriving group of 32 artists, 20 studios, and he worked alongside the city to create this environment that was so vibrant for many years. And now it's a hot spot for cannabis cultivation, unfortunately. But the most important aspect is to be able to sit with him, work with him, protect him, and also share these important stories of how we need to look after our elders, and the fact that these youngsters, right, where, wow, we were just arm's length of the beginning of an era of all of these incredible African American artists, and being a child and under this environment is impeccable. A lot of these paintings I'd never even seen either, right? They were in storage. You don't intrude on your father's space. That's like going into the lion's den. And they made it very difficult for you to walk through. So you have an environment that's cluttered chaos, but there's a system and a pathway. My father felt it was important for me to read every single book that he brought home, so I had to hurdle over books. And then his love for agriculture, the desert, philosophy, biology. I mean, he was just layered and layered and layered of this insight, and was also very challenging to sit with for 8-hour lectures, right? Because the minute I came up from Big Sur to go to Oakland, I was the only one on a Greyhound bus. And, it was just me, myself, and I had to sit there and hold on strong and try to keep myself awake, right? That was the real lesson, keep my eyes open somehow and listen. And then, even Dr. Radar Quenislan, I was able to visit with him multiple times. And when you walked into his apartment at Ventura Hill, I mean, he had the monkeys that were running wild with dogs and animals and art, and it was like this controlled chaos of pack rat and this musk, this tenseness, and every sweater, the kindest Norwegian ever. I mean, I'd like to make these, the Norwegian, language, but I bastardized it, but with great humor. He was just such a kind, chaotic, loved experimentation, loved to see everyone going into their own, artistic state of mind, altered state of mind, to see these magical, freaks on occasion. Michael Bowen, Michael McCracken, and Arthur were like the three thickest thieves, and it references it in the Frisco Kid book, and just magically everything that you knew and you thought. It's like our mother used to videotape us, in the 60s and 70s as children in Big Sur, and it wasn't until I think we were around our early 20s that she shared the video footage with us for the first time, and it just hits you with these dreams that you have, and these magical moments of curiosity, and then it comes to life. Where a lot of these paintings coming to the studio, and you just experience it, and then the layers and the calligraphy, and you see his travels within the paintings and the importance of each stroke and the tapes of him meditating into that altered state of mind, whether or not they were sex tapes, just the wind blowing, all different sorts of jazz, was playing 24/7, K-Jazz to KCSM to KPOO. But they're so special. It's how do you love one when you love so many, and when you live with them and you care for them, you realize that you become an amazing son to his father, and to experience the sensitivity of the dementia and the separation from the things that you love over time. I knew that, and experiencing primary care for the first time in my life, that when he had passed away in my arms, it was the first time that he had seen all of his children in the same room. So he truly exited with this sense of pride and to be able to release himself and let go as he really dove and immersed himself into each of these paintings. It's like, how do you value these paintings? They're all so priceless, and the colors and the walls changing, and for what the Sonoma Valley Museum of Art has been able to accomplish for our family and the history of African American artists has just been so precious and priceless. And for these photographers that have been a part of the fabric of this community for so long, it's just a blessing. I mean, you can't add more or less. It's just that this is a special moment in time to be here in Sonoma, and for you all to open your doors has just been absolutely priceless.
I was just going to say one thing that I think is obvious. You can see how much Alistair has done to sort of really help the whole family. The legacy of his father. I mean, this would not have existed without him, and I think it's obvious, but I just want to give him a shout out to that. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. So important. I keep thinking of things that I hadn't thought of earlier. When I met Arthur in that period of time at Cal Berkeley, there was amazing changes taking place on the part of everybody, not just African Americans, but specifically with African Americans, the discovery and the consciousness of African art was a new thing at that time to be taught, especially by Arthur and myself. Arthur and I talked many hours about the significance of African art. I noticed the first two, the earlier works that you see there have what I consider real obvious hints of African art. So that in teaching African American art, we both found it essential. And in order to teach African American art, you had to start with African art because it's where the roots were. It was a very interesting form. It turned me into a real African-phile when it came to art. And at the same time, Arthur's teaching on the campus with some of the best collectors of African art in the art department that Arthur had met as well. David Simpson, Earl Loran, and Felix Ruvalo. And here I was learning about African American art, but then I had faculty advisors that had been collecting art that just allowed me, as well as Arthur, to just peruse and look through these original works. It's one of the greatest things that ever happened to me as far as African art was concerned. And it helped us to grow a lot as well. A lot of students had a hard time recognizing the fact that Picasso and Georges Braque or Modigliani were all inspired by their French friends who had stayed in Gabon and brought back masks that were broke, and they sold these works. Picasso had a bigger personal collection of African art than the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York for a given period when it first started. I found that to be amazing, but we talked about things like that, and it just made me feel so much better about what I was doing, and him too, I guess. I just thought, wow, it's amazing. It's not just African American art history that starts in the 1700s here, that went back much further. And there was always a lot of controversy among the people who were teaching the subject. I'm sorry, not just teaching the subject, but practicing. And the identity of what to do if you're a black artist in the 1960s and 70s, what should you be doing? And there was a big disagreement, for some people thought you should be doing art that shows African people, to show your heritage. Other people say, no, I'm going to stick with the mainstream, which was abstract art. It's old American art. And then there were just different avenues that people were exploring. It was a good thing, but the inclusion of African art helped it tremendously. And you see it today in all sorts of ways, in food and in fashion and music, all these things that just explored. I always think that I feel like I was born at the best time in history right now, that I've lived through some amazing things. This is despite some heavy things going on, the Black Panthers, the identity. I mean, everybody was recruiting African American students. The Minister Farrakhan would come to Cal. This campus was the greatest, let's say, migration of African American artists going to Cal Berkeley. I think it was 6% of the students at that time. And everybody was recruiting. Minister Farrakhan came to speak with everyone and mentioned that if you still eat bacon, you can't be part of our group, but otherwise you can become a Muslim. Malcolm X had come through. There are all kinds of the women's movement, the anti-war movement. All these things are going on at the same time that we're discovering that there's our own identities, and that's another one of the things I appreciate so much about just our own intimate moments. He had these moments with other people as well. These things I remember so much from that time. And also, again, I want to shout out to the work being done, just amazing, and I hope my son is like that when I get older.
You think, does anybody have questions in the audience?
You're making me cry. Wow.
Well, this is beautiful, Jim Dennis, beautiful photographer, and these three really, run the block together. And each time I kind of close my eyes and open, I see these guys, these characters, night stalking or day stalking with their cameras as their weapon, right? And they're at the festivals and at parties. Jim hosts the most elaborate parties, but it's as a son, how do you start one foot at a time until you get into a rhythm. But I knew, just the first day that I could really shine light on Arthur's profession and the unknown. It's like going deep down into the abyss and finding new things and new categories and space and time to be able to breathe, and that would be accepted to him because he was so judgmental. If you hadn't written a million books without publishing them, you weren't really a true writer. He wanted you to study writing before you published books, photography, and paintings. And if you weren't able to debate with him and challenge him, then you were never invited over to his studio. And so there was a real protective mechanism. And he's like, ain't no turkeys coming out to East Oakland either. You got to get through the hood, right? And so that was another, but fair enough, I was always dedicated to give him that assistance. A lot of times I shut the door and got out of there when he was experimenting like Freud to eat 6-month-old chicken or something like that, right? It was like, hey, and that led to sepsis, right? And so you tried to influence him to be careful. And a lot of these artists, they segregate themselves from, the populace. They become immersed into their crafts and want to, produce. And then also there's kind of like a timeline of desperation that you kind of see a pattern and you have to engage with it. He started pumping out paintings over the last few years, and you were like, wow, is he saying something? And then you monitor, the food in the fridge. Is it becoming packed? And is he good food and bad food, and monitoring pots and pans? And those were just the little signals that they give you, that the natural environment, and gives you to become more concerned and to provide more care. And instead of visiting once a month, once a week, and then that turns into daily. And I caught him, because his best friend, Art Lewis, was in the hospital, and just that little foam at the mouth. And I caught him there, called the paramedics, and boom, he went into a cardiac arrest the next morning. And it took about 3 or 4 days to find out what the real issue was. And then we were on a discovery that once I lived with him and cared for him, the grapevine started talking, and then the Smithsonian called and said, we hear that your father's important. I said, well, he's been important, and it's definitely important to my ass. And he said, he was the Smithsonian calling. Get that booty on down here. What's taking you so long, right? Well, a week later, boom, the Smithsonian representative comes in, and she just sniffed the room and said, done, right? There was just no questioning, no mistaking on the importance and the magnitude of this work, and how he just had a catalog of books and writings and love letters and photographs, and that history was priceless. So I became engaged with the Smithsonian to say, we will donate our papers happily, but I want is on the list of artists. Not like we're trying to be better or worse or far in between, but who are the artists? Like, how many are there of Arthur Monroe's? And she says, oh wow, well we've got, you know, probably about a strong list of about 25 or 30. And then you're like, wow, that's a kick in the shin. You know, like, how they're not 50, 100, 1,000. No, there are only a few of Arthur Monroe's. And so then they invited me to New York to come to a gala, and that was quite an experience. They were honoring other African American artists, and you start that Oliver Jackson was there. He was being represented at that time, and then you know the name, and you met so many people over time, and then we start talking about, okay, who's out there? So Mary Lovelace O'Neill, Suzanne Jackson, and Lewis and Raymond's name comes up, and not to say that these guys are front of the list, and to have been true to their craft and their profession and their education and their hobbies are just, incredible. And not to mention that Raymond has another invaluable trait of his journals and his writings, art, and apparently you have a garage full of all of these, right? They add up. Could you please share a little bit more of that so I can keep plugging away with what you got?
Journals, I guess, just became fascinated with journals probably around the same time as the Beat era. It was a fascinating thing. So, but keeping a daily journal, I guess I've been doing for some 60 years now. I thought they were just for me, like pictures and writings and ideas and sketchbooks, but also I learned eventually that they belong to my friends and family as well. When COVID first hit, I thought, I've got to find something to do. So I'm going to take all 60 years of journals and photograph them and put them all on. They all fit on a thumb drive, believe it or not, so that you can see every single day. In case the journals were lost, they take up the size of a large refrigerator. One of my daughters says, "Don't worry about your journals. I'm going to take care of those." You don't want to carry that around for the rest of your life. So whatever happens to the books is another thing. But I guess the main thing is my son, for example, mentions, "Can I see the journal of 1989 or something for a year?" He had a hard time in elementary school. He kept that book for about 2 weeks, but when he came back, it was like, God, I feel so much better about myself. Look at all the good things that were happening in my life. I thought, oh, good. That's where I first realized that they were actually meant more to other people as well. My wife says, "Look at you! You had so much more hair when you were younger." Or I remember when we went to Europe, those pictures, so the reminders. But then I realized that today, with all of you, as well as us, with what we call our cell phones, are really journals of some sort. We're not necessarily writing. Some people do, in fact, write, but they're great. I see people that say, "Oh, here's a picture of him. I saw him 3 years ago. Isn't it? It's right here," and you get to actually keep track of things as long as you back them up. For instance, always back up everything. You lose your phone. But the old school journals are basically come in this form. It's kind of hard to show in here.
And when he said refrigerator, he meant a walk-in refrigerator.
Because they're sketchbooks. But what happens is that sometimes there are pictures of people that I know, sometimes there are pictures of people that I don't know. At the top of each page is a birthday of someone. Sometimes they're personal friends, sometimes they're people that you just happen to want to remember. But for the most part, for myself, it's handy to look, and you sort of realize just how wonderful our, not just mine, but our own individual lives. Sometimes people think these are more unique than their own lives, and so mine it's just visible. That's the name, but we all have these unique lives. That's why I was saying I think we live at to me the best time in history, even though people argue with me over that, but I'd rather be here now than any other time. And so keeping these, it's fun. I have a website that has a section on journal keeping, because I used to do regular workshops on them. And it turns out there's so many different ways. You don't have to use them every day. Some people write once a week. Some people only sketch. My sister used to keep perfume samples and wine labels in hers, or just all sorts of things. That's how I started. I was so jealous of what she kept that I started keeping my own. But it's a public domain idea that anyone can basically use. Sometimes it's just recipes, which is another form of keeping journals. Everybody here has some recollection of things, all the things that you just don't want to get rid of that mean so much that you've written. And that's why pictures are so essential.
I would agree, and just for our mother documenting, our livelihood over time has just been so precious. And then we get into obviously social media. Facebook has been, my number one attack on protecting and preserving our studio, and to be displaced, would be that's a whole nother can of worms. But we definitely want to protect these paintings and make sure that they're not just thrown out the back of the truck, but to really hold on to and to put them in the right hands so that they can be shared with the world, because they're all a part of the Bay Area. They're Bay Area paintings, they're our paintings, the public's paintings, and it's so sensitive because there's no I in team. It's about we together, and it takes a village to communicate and to connect with others as well as the next generation. What I've experienced here at the museum is that their youth programs and the writings on the wall and their interactions and their African drumming, they have these talks have been so mind-blowing and so important and vital to history itself, and we hope to be able to influence a whole nother group of artists to be able to be accepted into the community. But that's where we work together and we collaborate to find artists like Lewis and Raymond and all of the other beautiful artists that we're connected with as family. Suzanne Jackson and Mary Lovelace O'Neill, Oliver Jackson, Dewey Crumpler, Mary, Dewey, and Suzanne are really, and Oliver at the top of the mark. And they're at Mary and Suzanne Jackson are at the SF MoMA currently, and at the Whitney Benile. Those are very two and special shows that are happening as we speak. And I just wanted to close with the protection and the preservation of our elders. It's so important to understand the psychology and the behavioral patterns. My father was very fortunate to have a butler. I was a chauffeur, I was a chef, I was an event planner, I was a curator, and we had a lot of parties, and I made sure for him to live it to the utmost. And we had family parties, whether or not there were turmoil or not. We just wiggled right on through it, and it was important for him to feel young again and inspired that we loved him so much and we will never stop, and that he's with us each and every day, and we're surrounded by the love from you all, and to especially Leanna Keaton and her staff. So thank you so much.
Can't leave just yet. Thank you so much for being here. This incredible panel to go along with this amazing exhibit. Thank you all for your expertise. I had a couple people talking to me about if maybe you could relate a little bit how you see the jazz connect with the compositions of Arthur's work. I sit here, I look at this show, I almost imagine a double live greatest hits jazz album, with each painting being a song or multiple songs. And I see the blocks of color that seem more like Hans Hofmann Berkeley School than San Francisco, and see how those blocks relate to each other, and also the line making, which look very creative, spontaneous, like jazz. And wondered if you could just comment a little bit about that.
Well, I've always shared it's really truly in the eyes of the beholder, right? I mean, each painting can change over time to your own feelings and thoughts, and to understand them. two of the paintings in here are actually turned upside down. And when I shared, one of the most vibrant paintings that came across is the painting behind me, because Dr. Radar Quenislan's love for monkeys, and when we flipped this painting upside down to hang it at Jack London Square for him, then you see the monkey in silhouette here, and it blew my father's mind away when he saw that for the first time. And it's also sensitive, it needs some touch up, but it's talking to us, and it tells us that it doesn't want to be sent away, it doesn't want to move. So it's super special. But when you have high and low notes and the sound of bird speaking and crying and talking into his saxophone, and you have Charles Lloyd reciting poetry within the reed, and how the squeaks and the tones come out. I mean, his arms are constantly flowing like a conductor, and some of his paint brushes are long, some of them are short, fat, and stubby, right? And I've been able to use his tools and also use the studio to better understand his process. And I mean, I've always, jazz has been in my DNA. They say it's a fool's errand to start a jazz festival, because there are no sponsorships. You have to just figure it out. And that's, the chemistry with people that you have, and your work always supplementing your income for your love of your passion. The older I get, the passions get bigger and larger and wider. And it constantly becomes a challenge to be creative and to really truly be true to your craft. And Arthur spent, every night painting till 4 or 5 in the morning, and a night owl. He worked for 8 to 10 to 12 hours, being a chief registrar of the Oakland Museum. He was recruited there by Evangeline E.J. Montgomery, who's a very special, like my godmother, who worked for the State Department and wanted Arthur to be at the museum to hold ground and to also be able to share his wisdom with others and really chronicleize the unknown and also work as a Interpol networking system for museums to speak all around the world. But when you turn these paintings and shift them and move them, they talk to you in a different language, and that's where it's so beautiful to see people's the impression that they have, and when they walk into the studio, it can break you down. When you walk into the museum, not having the pure white walls versus the beautiful walls that we actually wanted for them to keep. It took a whole complete different turn on the visual and the emotion that comes out of them. So it's super special. And that's Mr. David Keaton, who answered and asked those questions, whom is Linda Keaton's husband, the executive director here, and it's very special to be a friend and family to them.
Yeah, very well said. I was just thinking, jazz as a plural aspect. Sometimes it seems singular to me, but there's so many genres of jazz. Jazz used to be a genre, but there's so many avenues of what we conveniently call jazz. Nowadays, some people say, I love jazz, but I don't want to hear anything by Albert Ayler, or there's certain names you realize it's just like it is with all paintings. There's so much different sound. I think about when I think maybe the origin of abstract art, again, that period in time I mentioned with Picasso and people in Europe that were starting to incorporate African art. Igor Stravinsky with the Rite of Spring, people rioted just because there's a part of this very calm, beautiful suite that turns into almost a battle of drums and boom, 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 cacophonous music, and people realize that, wow, it started there. And today it's the same thing. When people say they work in an abstract form, it doesn't tell me that much until I have to see. You realize all the different avenues. As Alistair was saying, sometimes you can turn something upside down. It's an entirely different meaning, or turn it one click to the left or to the right. Our perceptions of it, and that's one of the things I think about when people use jazz as a metaphor for abstract art. I don't know if that says as much, but the more jazz you listen to, and the more abstraction you see in art, the more you realize that plethora of sound.
And the motions and the tones and just the sound in general of a jazz musician going into an altered state and a meditative state of mind, and the freedom to go outside of the boundaries and come back in. You know, those are the borders of a canvas. They're very good. They go hand in hand. And on another note, of the importance of thinking outside of the box is the love that the Norwegians have for the Beat generation. And if you want to see that collection, you have to go to Norway, because there's, you know, a signed contract that these pieces in this collection will never come back to the United States. You know, Arthur and Dr. Radar, you know, really shocked the collection around, and there was no interest from the American soil to embrace them and love them, and that's where, you know, you have that separation and that segregation and that racist point of view of these being abstract paintings, and the Beat generation of the rebels, right, that were protesting against the war. So there was really a timeline and a period of mainstream bohemian versus the abstraction and you know, the avant-garde thinking, you know, the wild ones. But going back to the Civil War and the Panthers and Nina Simone standing up for your rights and having differences of opinion, these artworks went back to Norway, and when we visited Norway, you know, the Norwegians and in Sweden, they knew more about us and me, about my jazz festival, than I even knew. And that's where you really knew that back in time and over time, and a lot of the musicians will always share with you the love that Europeans have for American culture, as well as going to Cuba in the 90s when you're not speaking Spanish or English. They know the jazz. And jazz festivals always created a platform and a home for Latin music. So now you see, you know, even SF Jazz, if you go to a jazz center, they'll have Latin music there, or music from all around the world. Whereas when we put something different on the stage, we were frowned upon in the early 90s. They were like, you don't know what you're doing. It was like, well, you haven't never really truly sat down with Carlos Santana either, like I have, because he and Stevie Ray Vaughan used to perform at Montreux every year to bring the people so you could share the jazz with them. And so it goes hand in hand with the art on the wall. You always want to tell a friend. You always want to bring and incorporate the younger generation into these conversations and to share these invaluable museums, as Linda Keaton has provided for us all. So thank you.
I was just going to say shortly that I think the thing that connects the music to the art is the notion of improvisation, and sort of how linearity is questioned and turned on its head, which I think is really exciting, and that's what happened at a number of art venues and art backgrounds. That's all. Thank you all for coming.